All right. I would like to introduce Nadia, who's going to read her story, and she'll tell you what it is, but it's the Perpetual Quest on page 388. And I'll just give you a little backstory. When I went to the International Convention in Toronto, and I think it was 2005, and I am a member of Loners International, which is like an AA pen pal club. And so when I go to international conventions, I always take a new big book and I pass it around and let people sign it. And it makes the book more real for when I am, that's long. When I'm reading my book, I stop and I read notes and people's names, and it brings back memories. And so when I was in the Loners Hospitality Suite at the International and passing my book around, this lady gives me the book back and she says, I'm not telling anybody, but in the 4th edition, which is what I had then, she said, my story is in this book. And she said, it's called The Perpetual Quest. And she gave me my book back and her signature is in it. And that's how I got to connect with Nadia. We emailed several times over the years and we reconnected. And so during this big book, when we decided to have authors come and read their story, I didn't have old contact information. So I just did a Google search for Nadia. I knew her name and I knew where she was in Canada, and found an email and just sent it off at random, hoping it connected with her. And then I got an email back. And so that's how we reconnected. And she's kind and gracious and said she would give us some information, tell her how her story's in the book. And so Nadia, I am turning this over to you. Thank you for coming.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm Nadia. I'm an alcoholic. I'm a member of the Oasis group in Ottawa, Ontario. I got sober in Toronto at the old stock exchange meeting called the Downtown 515, which was a good thing because I wouldn't have made it till 8 o'clock. And in 87, I moved to Ottawa so my daughter could be around the rest of my family. And so that's why I'm a member of the Oasis group now, because I've been there ever since. And it's my pleasure to read my story. I was telling everyone that initially excuse me, I have a sore throat. I called the story Vodka Law and Me, and it was New York that named it the Perpetual Quest. And it literally wrote itself because I was in a hurry. I was going off to Ukraine and Russia and Armenia, where I'd been hired by the World Bank to do corporate governance, which was new then. They had incorporated companies, and I was the bearer of bad news that they hadn't even started with corporate governance. So that's why I say it literally wrote itself, because normally, you know, as lawyers, we do umpteen drafts, and I didn't. I printed it off and corrected some spelling mistakes, and that was it. So that's how it became the Perpetual Quest. And the last thing I'll say about the process was after they'd already accepted it, I got divorced. So I said, well, could I add one paragraph? And they said no, because they had a committee which went through all these hundreds and hundreds of stories, and each one had to be unanimously approved. It wasn't a majority thing. So it was such a large process that they couldn't add anything. But anyway, that's how I got the story. So shall I start reading now? Yep. Okay, the Perpetual Quest. This lawyer tried psychiatrists, biofeedback, relaxation exercises, and a host of other techniques to control her drinking. She finally found a solution uniquely tailored in the 12 steps. When I was a newly minted lawyer starting out in the practice of criminal law, there were 5 of us in our law office. My favorite lawyer was the eccentric, disheveled, wild-eyed Irish law professor who was brilliant or crazy, depending on your point of view, constantly cleaning out his pipe bowl with a black fingernail and tossing back vodka martinis whenever he got the chance. Then there was the new but world-weary litigation lawyer who told endless tales of his former life of white wine and bouillabaisse under the Mediterranean sun as he conducted his exporting business on the Riviera. Why would he leave such an ideal wine-drenched job in sunny climes to slog away at law school? I kept wondering. There was also a giant, good-hearted bear of a man who today is a judge who spent more time listening and helping others than he did practicing criminal law. Into this office landed a pair of know-it-all, fast-acting, but not too experienced young lawyers, my husband and me. And I'll say something about the sober judge at this point. Harvey was a great friend. I knew his wives, he knew my husband's, and when they had all died, I used to go to Toronto and we'd go, to the theater and go and dine and stuff. We were old friends. So what happened is I still choke up when I start to say it. One day I'm going down to the tuck shop and he holds up, it's like $10 and says, would you get me a pack of so and so? And I'm so stunned because he's got oxygen trails throughout the condo and he wants to smoke. And I didn't say anything. I was so stunned. And he was a huge man. He used to be a champion weightlifter before he was a lawyer and a judge. And so I said nothing. I took the $10. I went downstairs because he said, because if you won't get them, I'll have to go down myself. And of course, he had trouble walking because he had diabetes and all that jazz. So anyway, I go downstairs and the tuck shop guy says, I said, these are for Mr. Salem. And he said, yeah, he come down here and I tell him, don't, maybe you buy one because he buys 2 or 3 packs. So I gave him the cigarettes and I said to him, Harvey, you may not drink, but you are an addict just like the rest of us. And he looked me right back in the eye and said, I know. And so that makes 5 for 5 out of our group of 5 lawyers. And the others are all dead except for me. So, so I say within a dozen years, 3 of these 5 promising lawyers were dead from alcoholism, struck down at the peak of their careers. The judge is still and always has been a sober judge, but he died too from respiratory failure. And I somehow unwittingly, and even while drinking, turned into a corporate counsel and later, thankfully, became a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. The professor's kidneys gave out from one too many martinis. The exporting lawyer kept drinking till he died. Despite a liver transplant, my ex-husband died in a fire on what was to be, he had said, his last drunk before going to AA again when I was 10 years sober. Because I used to try and get him into AA, and the other lawyers in our lawyers group gave me permission to tell them they were all in AA, and he knew them all. He was a Crown attorney anyway. So I say I've been to too many premature funerals due to our good friend alcohol. My husband and I met and married in law school in a romantic haze of alcohol, twinkling lights, and much promise. We stood out as the only young married couple in our class. We worked and played hard, camped and hiked and skied and threw fabulous parties for our sophisticated friends and prided ourselves on staying away from drugs. Yeah, I kept us off drugs. In those days, that was in the early days, we actually lived in Yorkville, which was Drugsville, but we didn't do drugs until we separated and he started to do drugs. And he used to say the cops had the best drugs because he was a Crown attorney and the goddamn cops killed him. Anyway, we prided ourselves on staying away from drugs. It was fear that kept me away from drugs, fears that I might not get called to the bar. That's the other bar, the legal one. If I were convicted of possession of illegal street drugs. More importantly, my best friend was wonderful, powerful alcohol, and I loved it. So until I was 4 years old, I lived upstairs in a tavern where I saw a few drunks bounced around. My mother worked for relatives who also lived over the tavern, and whoever had time looked after me. Despite my pleas, my mother married a violent man, and we moved away to a life that made my tavern life look really holy. I kept running away back to that tavern until it was demolished. I still fondly look at pictures of that place. By the age of 14, I had my first drunk, which ended in a minor police visit to my home because I played with the Ukrainian dance band and we had more drinks than money. So by the age of 18, I was a daily drinker, and by age 21, I had my first year-long binge in France, which I euphemistically referred to as my study year abroad. I came home very sick and drunk. A few months later, I went to bed with a bottle of scotch one night and decided I would go to law school. If you're having trouble, try something that is even more difficult to show them. That was my philosophy. It was enough to drive me to drink, and it did. And of course, in those days, there were no women in law school. Unlike today, it's very hard to get in, and there's LSATs and everything. We didn't have that. And I heard afterwards, U of T told me to finish my fourth year, and Osgoode Hall took me. And I heard afterwards that Dean Ledane had said they would take all the women they could get their hands on. So there were 6 of us in a class of 240. And the first week, of course, I got so scared I went on a binge. I came back, and the professor, it was kind of noticeable, there were so few of us. One of the profs said to me, "Have you been sick?" And I said, "Sort of." So now I've lost my place here. When I drank, the fear evaporated and I became articulate and apparently very, very funny, or so they said then. Years later, I drank so much that I was no longer funny, but at the time, the drinks and the stories and the camaraderie were as wonderful as I was witty. We would get home to sleep by 1 or 2 in the morning, and the next day we would be up early to start all over again. The fortitude and resilience of youth made us invincible. Yeah, we got married. My husband and I, as I say, there were so few women, and so we got married in first year law, second year law, I think, yeah. And uh, for a while we kept each other going, but that faded after a while because I stayed off the drugs and my husband. And unfortunately, by the time we thought it was time to have a real life, maybe start a family, the marriage disintegrated. I was then 28 years old, getting divorced, drinking all the time, and seeing a psychiatrist 3 times a week, trying to solve my problem. And I have a little story there because I had a good friend who was a very elegant gay guy. He used to be a maitre d' in a fancy restaurant. And he had the misfortune of living across the street from my shrink. So I would go to the shrink's for my appointment. Then I'd go over to Wolf's apartment where I drank all his scotch and pass out. And then he'd put me to bed till I woke up. And what I used to say is just what an elegant gay guy needs is a drunk woman in his bed. Yeah. Anyway, I thought I found part of the answer when I stumbled into a private controlled drinking program, which helped me during the initial 30-day mandatory period of abstinence to hook a very large rug row by row, well into many nights. One more row, I kept saying, gritting my teeth against the drink. And I still have that rug, believe it or not. My period of abstinence also helped me get a better job in the corporate world, away from all those hard drinking criminal lawyers. That was a story in itself because it's very hard to escape from criminal law to corporate, but I did, but there's no time for that story. And I got a new 3-story, 4-bedroom house, just what every single woman needs. It helped me to quit the psychiatrist. During this absence, I also got out of a sick relationship which reproduced the violence of my childhood. Yeah, that was after my divorce. Incredibly, I did not connect the improved manageability of my life in the short period of abstinence to the absence of booze. It didn't matter in the long run because unfortunately, I started to get drunk again. I recall being fixated on that first glass of wine I was allowed to drink the day my coach informed me that I was ready to start drinking in a controlled fashion. My tongue was almost hanging out. So I guess you can figure out that controlled drinking programs never did work. They used to be at the old Addiction Research Foundation, and they had to get rid of them because they didn't work. Many drunks later, I tried everything I could, more therapy, different psychiatrists. It was always to be the next one who would solve my problem. Biofeedback, relaxation exercises, antabuse. They've banned that now. That's if you drink on antabuse, you can get really sick. You can actually die. And I used to shrink the time between the antabuse and the drinks. So I think they've gotten rid of it, the regulatory authorities. Lots of self-help books from Freud to Jung to every current fad that was published or taught. All to no avail, of course, because I'd always end up drunk. Came the day when I realized I couldn't keep dragging myself off to work in the morning and spending half the energy of every day concealing the fact that I was a barely functioning drunk. I would go home to drink until I passed out, come to in the middle of the night, terrified, listen to the radio, get worldwide telephonitis. Yes, I had that. Finally dozing off at dawn, just in time to be awakened by the alarm and start the process all over again. I gave up on relationships of any significance, saw my friends less, and stopped committing myself to most social occasions because I could never count on being sober. More and more, I just worked and went home to drink, and the drinking was starting to outstrip the working. One day I was so hungover at lunchtime, I called a friend and had a little cry. I've tried everything and nothing works, I said, reciting my litany of doctors and different therapies. I did not remember that 13 years earlier, when I was 21 years old, I had attended a few meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous after waking up one morning, not knowing where I was. I had just started law school and was terrified most of the time, so I went on a binge to quell the fear, which only got worse. I have no idea what made me go to AA back then. But there were no young people at the meetings, and people kept marveling how young and fresh I looked. And somebody actually pinched my cheek and said, "Oh, how nice and fresh." No one at AA said that when I came back 13 years later. My friend suggested that we contact a man she knew who was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I agreed to call him. "Perhaps he could call you," she said helpfully, which was the key, because by that night I was just fine. I didn't need any outside help aside from a drink or two. But he kept phoning and bothering me about going to a meeting. When he told me he went to AA meetings 3 or 4 times a week, I thought, poor man, he's nothing better to do. What a boring life it must be for him running around to AA meetings with nothing to drink. Boring indeed. No bouncing off walls, no falling downstairs, no regular trips to hospital emergency rooms, no lost cars. That was a good one. Fortunately for me, I didn't put oil in the car and the car died. And the guys at the office were trying to get me to buy a Corvette. And they had picked everything out for me, but I did not get a car until I had stopped drinking. And that saved my life and probably somebody else's. Oh. No falling downstairs, no regular trips to hospital emergency rooms, no lost cars, and on and on. My first meeting back at AA was on an unseasonably hot June night, but there was not a cool drink in sight in that church basement. The smoke could have choked a horse. Today it's much improved. And of course, there's no smoking today in most meetings. Um, and a fanatical woman with smiling bright eyes eagerly explained to me that they had this important book I should buy. Thinking they were doing the book promotion because they needed the money, I said firmly, "I'll give you the money, but I don't want your book," which about sums up my attitude and explains why for the next few months I continued to get drunk in spite of dragging my body to meetings every few days. I would stare at that large vodka bottle in the kitchen cupboard and say, "You won't get me," but it always did. I always lost the battle and ended up drunk. My last hangover was on a Friday before a long summer weekend. I had struggled through the day feeling small and hopeless. hiding the trembling of my hands when I had to sign documents and desperately working to wrap my tongue around words during meetings. Later that Friday night, after an agonizingly long workday, I was dragging myself up the deserted street, thinking that the whole world except for me had someplace to go on that long weekend. And what's more, they all had someone to go with. The first difference between that night and all the others was that I did not immediately go directly to a bar to get lubricated or home with my regular giant weekend supply of booze. Instead, I went to my club to swim, where strangely enough, I also did not drink. I was so hungover I had to give up trying to swim and instead wrapped myself in a bathrobe and sat in a dark corner of the locker room lounge for 2 hours, feeling desperately sorry for myself. And here you have to keep an open mind. If I had heard a story like mine, I probably wouldn't have believed it. I don't know what happened during those 2 hours, but close to 8 o'clock, I leaped up, jumped into my clothes, raced off to a meeting I'd had no intention of attending. It was a bit like getting a rap on the head with an invisible hammer and having my brain flip over because seeing the meeting seemed to be radically different from the last time I'd been there. And so, yeah, I hopped the subway. This um, club was on College Street. It was right near the subway. I hopped the subway and went up to the Delisle room. The people looked animatedly alive. The weirdos who'd been attending before were absent that night, and the books on display actually looked interesting. I bought the book Alcoholics Anonymous, listened intently, and then for the first time, I went for coffee with these people and listened some more. And here you have to keep an open mind. I've got it written in the book. Late that night at home, there was a presence in the room with me, even though I lived alone. The next morning, I knew I didn't have to drink. I remember I had very little furniture in this huge bedroom, and I was literally holding the blankets up to my chin, going like this. And there was like, I felt there was something in the room with me. So I didn't drink. That night, I went to a step meeting where they discussed step two, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And I actually talked about God, the one who had abandoned me when I was very little, very frightened, and very hurt. My stepfather used to beat me up and drag me to church. In the weeks and months that followed, I did everything that was suggested to me. I went to a meeting every day, read the books and literature, got a sponsor who told me to have a quiet time every morning and tried to pray and meditate or at least sit still for a few minutes before racing off for the day. Since I prided myself on adhering to the intellectual principle of not having contempt for anything prior to investigation, I tried to keep an open mind, no matter what anyone said and how stupid I thought it was. That probably saved my life. I joined a downtown group. Yeah, and it was at 5:15. It was the old downtown 5:15. I don't think it exists anymore. I wouldn't have made it till 8 p.m. Soon I got into service. I was given bank books, notes of business meetings, and various other instructions, told to do whatever was necessary to keep the meeting going. I did that job for quite some time, and I instituted regular business meetings and found an eager newcomer to whom I eventually turned over the bank books and papers. I had a lot of problems in those early days, but no matter what the problem, I was repeatedly told to seek more spiritual development. I remember the man who used to say that to me. Something that did not interest me, more spiritual development. I was told that my purpose here on earth was to be of maximum service to God and the people around me, and that didn't interest me either. However, I said nothing, listened, kept going to meetings, mostly step discussions where I heard people talk about how they practice the steps and about the big book, our selfishness, and helping others. Sometimes I thought they were nuts, those meetings. Often I thought they were boring, but I kept listening and trying to relate. Oh, I remember this. Soon after, a friend of mine was killed by a drunk going the wrong way on the freeway. A truck driver talked about driving long hauls drunk. I was horrified and repelled until I paused to recall that I used to drive when I couldn't walk straight. When my friend was killed, my AA friend said, don't drink, don't think, go to meetings. I went to a meeting where I sobbed and gnashed my teeth, but I didn't drink. And so not only was I at the old stock exchange group, but we had a lawyers group there. And they physically dragged me around whether I liked it or not. I became as compulsive about AA as I had been about drinking, which was necessary because I'd been told to spend as much time at meetings as I had spent drinking. I went to every AA get together possible, was saturated with AA. I listened to tapes of AA talks. I read and reread the literature and books, laughing into the night over Dr. Bob and the old timers, which was new then, and it's a good book. You should read it, and the good old timers. I signed up for an Loners Internationalist meeting, which I did. So I used to go to a meeting and then I come home and write up the meeting. And in those days, before internet, people didn't have meetings in far locations. And now they do, but there's still this, because some people still don't do internet. And there's a lot of written things in this thing. So I get both the online one as the paper. I listened to tapes of AA talks. I read and reread the literature and books, laughing into the night over Dr. Bob and the good old timers. And yes, I would write up meetings for loners and send them off. Um, I once um, I once wrote to a guy in Africa who had been in an accident and killed someone by accident. And he came home and he had nothing except he got my letter. So you can never tell. This helped me to remember what I had heard, and by sharing helped someone else. And here it is. Yeah, I once wrote to a man who received my letter the same day he had killed someone in a car accident, which would no doubt make one very, very thirsty. Many years later, although alcohol is not part of my life and I no longer have the compulsion to drink, it can still occur to me what a good drink tastes like and what it can do for me. From my standard attention alcoholic taste buds right down to my stretched out tingly toes. As my sponsors used to point out, such thoughts are like red flags telling me something is not right and I'm stretched beyond my sober limit. It's time to get back to basic AA and see what needs changing. That special relationship with alcohol will always be there waiting to seduce me again. I can stay protected by continuing to be an active member of AA. And my sponsor said, um, you're not responsible for what enters your mind, but you're responsible for not entertaining it. And so, yes, you can conjure up the taste of anything, but I don't, because it enters your mind, but you don't entertain it. The hardest thing I had to deal with in sobriety was my own anger and the violence I lived through in my childhood. I had forgiven those involved as best as I could, but the mind seems never to forget. I had gratefully received years of outside help because I was told my drinking was only the symptom of deeper troubles. Yet, despite the help of many professionals I know, I would never have recovered from violence and alcoholism without AA's 12 steps, which are uniquely tailored for people like me. And my stepfather was a tailor, so when I became a lawyer and my husband was a lawyer, he used to make us these suits, custom made suits where you couldn't gain 2 pounds. So, he tried. Just as importantly, I believe that I recovered through the grace of a higher power, despite the fact that I was very angry and wanted nothing to do with God when I arrived at Alcoholics Anonymous. In fact, I did not need to find God. I only needed an open mind, and the Spirit found me, literally. When I was 5 years sober, I met a man in AA who was also 5 years sober. He said that the rocks in my head fit the holes in his. Today we have a daughter who has never seen her parents drink and who sees them try to help others in Alcoholics Anonymous. We have a nice home and a sober family life in a community with lots of AA friends and meetings. It's a long, long way from that first AA meeting, and it couldn't get much better. And so, as I say, I asked New York if I could add a paragraph there since I was no longer living happily ever after. And that's when they told me no, because there had been all the many hundreds of stories they read. The consensus had to be not just majority, but total consensus, unanimous. And so they didn't let me add anything. But I'm telling you, by that time I was divorced, but it didn't make a difference. I continued in AA, and I'm still in AA, and it's 43 and a half years now. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Nadia. On behalf of everybody, thank you. We'll let everybody unmute after the questions and answers. And if you have any questions you would like to ask Nancy, Nadia, please put them in the chat to me and I will ask her after Carrie does her interview. I still am a member of Loners International all these years later. And there are still people all over the world that still don't have meetings, and we still communicate by letter. And also, people
We have an international lawyers meeting that's got lawyers from around North America and even from Japan online.
Yeah. And I wrote to a woman in prison. We did her steps by letter, and she was there because she drove drunk and killed somebody. And every time she was up for parole, it got denied. And I said, there's a reason that happened. And I got a letter from her a while after that. And she said she got a new cellmate, and they're talking about why they're in a maximum security women's prison in Texas. And she told her cellmate that I drove drunk and killed somebody. And her cellmate said my cousin was killed by a drunk driver. She was in her 20s. And it turns out the young lady she killed was the cousin of her new cellmate. And so she got to make a direct demands, or, what I've learned through Loners International, some of us wrote to the same people. We may still do that. And we find out by writing and saying, I got a letter from so-and-so. And I remember being new, coming home one day saying, I'm too tired to drive a half hour to a meeting. And I get a letter from somebody in South Africa, Malawi. And he said he had to drive 6 hours on African dirt roads once a month to get to a meeting where two people spoke English. Or a lady in Canada that took an airplane and 2 or 3 taxis. And I said, I can drive to a meeting. So thank you, Nadia. We'll ask the questions after Carrie asks you her questions. I'll ask the questions in the chat. And if you have any, send them to me. And then after all the questions are asked, then we will let everybody unmute and thank Nadia. So Carrie, I'm turning it over to you now.
Hello, Carrie. I'm an alcoholic. Nadia, thank you so much. What an interesting story. And to hear it from your own voice is just so impactful. Remind us, what was the name that you had called your story?
Vodka, Law, and Me.
Vodka, Law, and Me. Got it.
Yeah, and it turns out our Canadian Bar Insurance Association tells us lawyers have triple the rate of alcoholism, 6 times the suicide rate. Everybody in my story is dead, and one of my classmates committed suicide.
Wow, goodness. And what is your sobriety date? You said you started drinking at age 14.
Yeah.
When did you come into the program?
At 34, it was August 1st, 1980. So I'm 43 and a half years sober, and I'm about to turn 78 to save you the math.
Wow, congratulations. So how has it been for you having your story in the 4th edition of the Big Book? When people find out that your story is there, what happens? What's been your experience? How has people knowing that affected, you?
And not much, first of all, because I don't go around announcing it. And as I said before, a lot of people don't read the stories. And it took 4 years before one of my own sponsees came up and said, your story's in the book, because she had read the stories. What I have started to do is when a newcomer buys a book, I sign my story and put my phone number in there. I think that's like a good opportunity to get them interested in a story. And occasionally they'll call me, most of the time not, but I do let them know that there are some other interesting stories in there.
How interesting. And what inspired you to submit your story?
I guess I was writing to loners internationalists and excuse me, I have 5 or 6 grapevine stories too. So I've always written in AA, and they had just called for stories. And as I said, I was rushing off to Europe. So I literally, the thing wrote itself. That was very unusual. That's called grace, an unearned gift. It and with very few changes and everything. I think New York barely made any changes too. They've had some funny things, like when I said we lived over a tavern, they say things like, I guess it's a US thing, up from a tavern, little tiny things like that. But yeah, so I've always written in and I've always written in AA, so I just dashed it off.
Great. And Nadia, can you tell us a little bit more about your relationship with God and your spiritual life when you got sober?
Yes, I wasn't interested in God, not the least. And as I say, I grew up getting slapped around and dragged to church. So when I saw the God bit, I thought, oh, so even after I had that sort of bonk on the head that got me going to meetings and staying sober, I still wasn't too with it on the God business until that one day, which you have to keep an open mind for, that I belonged to this women's club. It was the Friday before a long weekend. I was at the club. There was nobody there. And I say, so feeling so sorry for myself because everybody had gone away and they all had someone to go with except me, you know, and all that. And I sat there in the locker room after trying to swim. And then I, for no reason at all, it was like getting a bonk on the head. I jumped up, I got dressed, I ran to the subway, I went to the meeting, and everything changed. And that was not my doing. What else can I say? It sounds weird, I guess, especially to newcomers or someone who doesn't like the God bit. But the other thing is that over the years, I've heard so many different ways of how to treat God. Like, you know, it can be the AA group. Your group is your higher power. You know, you think of it as a higher power, that all kinds of people and things and groups, especially your group, your home group can be your higher power. That's what works, I think, for anybody if they're willing to keep an open mind. And in Toronto, we had that slogan, keep an open mind, and I said that saved my life.
You know, following up on that, I loved the sentence, since I prided myself on adhering to the intellectual principle
Yeah.
of not having contempt for anything prior to investigation, I tried to keep an open mind, no matter what anyone said and how stupid I thought it was. So that really sounds like that was an important concept in your
Definitely.
early sobriety.
Definitely. And isn't that in the front of the book? I thought it was. Maybe not. It's somewhere. Maybe it's a grapevine forwards. No, it's, oh, I've forgotten how many forwards there were. Forward to the 3rd edition. Can't see it. It's somewhere in the, maybe it's in the grapevine. I don't know. But that contempt prior to investigation, you can't intellectually argue with that. I think that's what leaves it open to your not knocking it, put it that way. So I might not have wanted to believe it, but I stopped knocking it. Yeah.
Drew's pointing out that it's in Appendix 2, the contempt prior to investigation.
Oh, is it? Appendix
Mhm.
2? Oh, good.
And it's the quote by Herbert Spencer at the very end.
Yes, yes. Yes, that's good.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about how you got a sponsor and how you worked the steps? What was your process?
Well, I mentioned to you that we had a lawyers group at the stock exchange. By the way, the stock exchange meeting was great. It was the downtown 515. The reason it was great is there was a probation officer, and to the chagrin of the Suits, she used to make all her kids on probation come there. And that made it a perfect mix and a perfect meeting. But as I say, the Suits hated it. However, there was a lawyers group. We used to meet in different lawyers' offices and stuff, but they all came to the downtown 515. And the way I got a sponsor is as they were dragging me off somewhere, someone said, "Here, talk to her. She'll be your sponsor." That was literally how it happened. And actually, she was a great sponsor, and she was the exact opposite of me. I was the lawyer on Bay Street, which is like Wall Street. So there, I'm a lawyer, and she was a housewife whose husband had dumped her because she was a drunk. But she was a great sponsor for me. She was very kind. She listened to my nattering endlessly about things. And I remember one day it occurred to me how I bothered her every day. And I said, "Oh my God, I've been talking at you so much," because I called her every day and natter. She said, "Well, you don't quite natter quite as much as you used to." So that was how I started. But she was a great sponsor. Till I moved to Ottawa, I got another sponsor. And the little side story there is she had gotten her 10-year medallion and she stopped going to meetings. And I kept saying, "Jan, don't you think you should go to a meeting?" And she kept saying, "No, I have my books and I talk to my friends and I this and I that." So I'm sitting in my office in Ottawa. I became the general counsel of the Canadian Red Cross during its worst 10 years of history. Now, there's a reason to drink, and I didn't. And I'm sitting in my office, and I get a call from my sponsor's daughter that she had found her mother drunk at the bottom of the stairs. So this is always a lesson in people who think they don't need meetings anymore. That's inevitably what happens. But she was a great sponsor while she was my sponsor, and then I got a sponsor in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what about working the steps?
Yeah, I've always worked the steps. I have a step study that somebody introduced me to, and I've passed it on. And we try to get at least another person. Like I found that the groups disintegrate because someone starts, then they can't come, and then they. But what I do with this step study is I do it with people I sponsor. So every time I ask them to do it, I do it. And that's good for me as well as for them. And yeah, so over the years, I've done that step study, I don't know how many times. And in fact, I was trying to get someone just to start it now, have a new person. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, what were meetings like when you got sober?
Oh, they were good because I told you we had all those kids that were on probation. So it was a real mix, a real mix. The Suits couldn't stand, but when I look back now, that was the perfect kind of meeting. And Joan Bloomfield, she died a long time ago. She was the probation officer. The guys used to really drive her crazy because she kept bringing these kids. And I do remember one of those guys, I'm trying to remember his name, it was something like Joseph. For my 5th birthday, one of those strange guys brought me a great big beer mug. I should have kept it. I didn't keep it. It was a big, beautiful beer mug about this big, and he gave it to me for my birthday. Like he didn't have a clue, but he was trying to celebrate my birthday, so he gave me a giant beer mug. So it was a good mix. It was a good mix.
Mhm. Great. And so you shared with us that in the end, you wish you'd had an opportunity to add a paragraph. Can you tell us a little more what that paragraph would have been?
Well, I just thought I should say that I wasn't living happily ever after, that I was
Mhm.
divorced. But ultimately, it's not really relevant to the story, except to the extent that you can get through anything and still stay sober. And I've had over the years a lot of opportunities, like I've written grapevine stories, and my favorite grapevine story is one that I wrote about the creation of the Cave Women's Group. When I went to Ukraine, there were meetings. They were Russian and Ukrainian. So one person spoke Russian, then that one spoke Ukrainian, and so on and so forth. And Ukrainian and Russian are a bit like Spanish and Italian. So you don't really understand, but you kind of get it. And there were no women's greetings. And I was at a regular meeting one day, and 3 women in a row said, at that time, they didn't have stories. They just had the main text of the big book, and they had it 12 and 12. And 3 of them in a row said, okay, so I read the steps, and now what do I do? And after the third one said that, I said, okay, girls, whoever wants to do the steps, just the women, please, no guys, come to my house on Sunday and we'll do the steps. And we did. And what happened was phenomenal. I mean, one woman I didn't know, her husband threw her out because she was a drunk. She was living in one room with a mattress on the floor with her 13-year-old son. She started out doing construction work, which was just all in apartments. Cave has no houses, it's all condos and apartments. And she ended up creating a construction company and having a house outside of Cave as well as apartments inside. Another one started an organic cafe in downtown Cave. They all were so successful from this few meetings that we did for, the last time I saw them was quite a while ago, but everybody was staying sober, and now a lot of them have fled. One is still there. That creative one is still in Cave, so I stay in touch with them. It's pretty horrible. You need to pray for those people. It's horrendous. I won't even go there.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you for sharing. Thank you very much. It's so very interesting to speak with you. Carol, I think that's all from me.
All right. Thank you,
I know.
Kate, very much. Thank you, Nadia. Drew, would you like to share anything or add something?
Thanks again, Nadia. I'm Drew, and I'm an alcoholic, and this is it's about a nerd factor of about 9.6, but it's a little dark. But you were talking about the suicide rates. The gentleman that killed himself in Bill's Kitchen was a lawyer from Ottawa who lived probably it says 352 Midland Avenue. So just throwing that out there. His name was Bill Cousins.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty bad. Pretty bad. Hmm.
Nadia, I have a few questions in the chat, and if you have anybody else has any, please put them in the chat. We'll ask them. One of them, I was going to ask you, was there a story you read in a previous edition Big Book that influenced you or inspired you to submit your story? And one of the questions in the chat is, what is your favorite story other than yours in the Big Book?
Well, the one that initially, and I actually met the author at some point, though I can't remember his name, was the one that talked about acceptance so much that in the fourth edition, they changed the title of the story to something about him promoting acceptance. And that used to be everybody's favorite story. And that's why I think they changed the name of it to deal with acceptance. So I think that was it. The tightrope might have been. I'm just looking through. You'll find one in there that says it's something like the doctor promotes acceptance.
In the third edition, it's called Dr. Alcoholic Addict, and in the fourth
You're
edition,
right.
called
Yeah.
Acceptance is the Answer.
What's it called now?
Acceptance is the Answer.
Oh, okay. Acceptance is the action. That's right. Yeah.
Somebody asked what your home group is in Ottawa today. What group do you go to?
I go to the Oasis group, and I've been there ever since 1987 when I moved to Ottawa. I had my daughter, and I wanted her to be around my family, and I had grown up in Ottawa, but I ended up in Toronto for 20 years, going to law school and practicing law. So when I came back to Ottawa in 87, I joined the Oasis group, and I've been there ever since. And before that was the 7 years at the downtown 515 in Toronto. Yeah.
Let's see. Is there something when you submitted your story that they removed in the editing process that you wish they left in?
Not a lot. No, not really. Actually, there were very few edits, and the ones they made were strange, I thought, but very few. And they didn't let me add that I was no longer living happily ever after, but that's okay. Yeah, yeah. So no, it was minimal, really minimal. But as I say to you, that story seemed to write itself. That's not like how I write now, or usually lawyers, are very big on checking everything umpteen times. So that was unusual, and it was in part, it probably was a better story because I had a lack of time. I was getting ready to go to Europe, and I had to do all kinds of things here. And so, and then I saw that ad, and I think they had it in a grapevine. Yeah, and I've always read the grapevine, so yeah.
That's what one of the other authors said. She just wrote it at the last minute and sent it in, and it kind of wrote itself. And when I wrote mine, it did. And when I write for Loners International, it just writes itself.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
how do you apply the steps in your daily life, and how soon did you get a sponsor and work through the steps, and what service did you get into service right away, and did you have?
Well, in Toronto, yes, I did to get into service, mainly because the lawyers pushed me into everything. It was a pretty good group. And here in Ottawa, yeah, I've always got some job or other in my group. Right now, I'm just supposed to start being the general service rep for this area, and I haven't done that in a very long time, so I've got to look it up and get on with it. But over the years, I've had all kinds of different positions, and not that I can think of them all now. Mostly I write things. So if something needs writing up, a procedure or something like that, I used to do all that. I did that for Intergroup. Intergroup drove me crazy. They go amending bylaws and things and making a mess, and then they want me to come and do it. So I've done it about 4 times, and then I told them I won't do it anymore.
Okay. When you think back about your story and your early recovery, are there any slender threads, like if XYZ didn't happen, you might not be here, or if you did, you heard somebody and it brought you into AA, or is there something that if it did not happen, you might not be here?
Well, maybe those lawyers dragging me around, whether I liked it or not, that might be a good one to focus on. Though the main thing is, I think I was just emotionally drained and had it the time when I jumped up and ran off to a meeting in downtown Toronto early in my sobriety, that because I had trouble staying sober at first. And then for no reason at all, that one day, I think I was just so defeated. And it was like getting a bonk on the head and waking up. And I went to the meeting and everything had changed, because I remember going to some of those meetings, and that meeting doesn't exist anymore. But I remember going to a meeting where this woman who used to bring the probation guys with her said to me, "Have you got $5? We've got this book." And I said, "I'll give you the $5. I don't want your book." And that's what a bad attitude I had to begin with. And then eventually, when I got it, of course, I read everything in sight, bought everything in sight, and tried. So I think it is, I call that grace. Grace is defined as an unearned gift, and you get it occasionally. So I figure someone said, this one's never going to get it. Let's make her useful. That's
Oh.
what.
Do you have a favorite line in the Alcoholics Anonymous book?
A favorite line. Can't think of anything offhand, though I have a lot of our stuff underlined, which is what the guys used to stress to me. We alcoholics must be rid of our selfishness. We must, or it kills us. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. That's on page 62. So they're mostly things that the others pointed out to me early on, you know. And now my memory's so bad, you know, I can reread the stories and they'll be new.
I've got two more questions, Nadia. Has having your story in the big book increased your understanding of humility? Or
I don't know, maybe. I didn't announce it. That's why I say to you, it took 4 years before somebody I was sponsoring came up and said, you have a story in the book. So I guess what it has done for me is it's been an introduction to newcomers. So if they get the book, and I mentioned I will sign it for them and put my phone number in.
okay,
And so it gives them somewhere to start, you know. That has helped me.
thank you. And I know a lot of people share when they read this story. Like for me, I identified with stories, you know,
Yeah.
because I didn't go to jail or get a DUI. Maybe I'm, you know, not. And then I read a story like it might have been worse, where it said I didn't have to do that. So
Right.
one more question. Has AA changed today? Do you think you could get sober if you came into Alcoholics Anonymous today?
Well, well, given that I got sober by grace, and that means it wasn't my doing, then I suppose I could get sober anytime. I think the big difficulty that had started when I was getting sober are the drugs today. That's really tough and much more prevalent than it was then. As I say, I lived in, like now it's a millionaire's place in Yorkville, but in Yorkville, when I was in law school, we lived in this decrepit apartment building. There were people with pot plants out back growing, and we respectfully didn't touch the pot plants and stuff. So I don't know. Today it must be much harder because there's so much more drug. There are so many more drugs to deal with. and there were drugs then, but not the way there are now. And I think that must make it very difficult for young people. Though the ones I see staying sober don't do drugs.
Thank you. Is there something you learned in your early sobriety that you still rely on a lot? Maybe like a prayer that your sponsor told you, something you read that, you know, when chips are down, this is what you go to, I mean, quickly or think of that comes to mind?
Yeah, what she told me that I still do is she said, before you rush off in the morning, if you don't do anything else, sit still for 5 minutes. And so I have my meditation books there and my 24 hours a day book, which is ancient. It's been there forever. It's falling apart. And it's not even formally approved by AA, but it's a good book. So before I run off, I always take those few minutes. If I'm in a hurry, I still read one meditation in the morning. So that's what I've always taken. And that was from my first sponsor. She said, if you don't do anything else, it's still for 5 minutes. Excuse me, now I've got the hiccups.
Thank you. I set my bedroom clock about 10 minutes fast, so I have that time in the morning. Nadia, thank you so much for making time to do this with us. We're honored to have you. Is there any